Hello, my name is Rachel Sellers, and today I'm presenting on Canada's reputation and immigration in early American slave narratives. Canada regularly makes appearances in the literature, news, and even the popular culture of the U.S. In 1985, Canada appears in Margaret Atwood's novel The Handmaid's Tale as a refuge from the regime of Gilead in the U.S. Canada plays an even larger role in the new Hulu TV series that is based on the same novel. In an episode of The Daily Show from 2018, a segment titled Refugees Ditch America for Canada shows how refugees are leaving the U.S. and moving to Canada because, as one asylum seeker states, America is a great country, but with the way things are right now, we need a better life for ourselves. That better life, he believes, is in Canada. Being one of only two countries to share a border with the U.S., it is easy to see why references to Canada appear in narratives written about the U.S. By exploring American literature specifically, Americans' attitudes toward its northern neighbor are apparent. For example, early American literary narratives, especially slave narratives, depict Canada as the North Star, the Promised Land, and the terminus of the Underground Railroad. Canada's influence and significance on the literary history of the U.S. is underestimated and sometimes disregarded. Focusing on the portrayal of Canada within American literary narratives of the 19th century and considering the historical events of the time provides rich illustrations of how Canada gained its reputation, why people risked their lives to reach Canada, and how fugitive slaves managed to escape to Canada. The ultimate purpose of this paper is to identify and examine these covert representations and illuminate the ways in which Canada became unofficially regarded as, and possibly remains to this day, a safe haven for fugitive slaves, immigrants, and outcasts of U.S. society. While slavery existed in both Canada and the U.S., the scale and forms of slavery in each country varied significantly. The scale of slavery in the U.S. was much larger and lasted much longer than that of Canada. Canada abolished slavery earlier in 1833, and, due in part to the Fugitive Slave Acts in the U.S., Canada became a terminus of the Underground Railroad. Canadians sympathetic for blacks fleeing slavery in the U.S. refused to repatriate runaways, which infuriated Southerners in the U.S., typically slave owners. Ken Alexander argues, Canada began to develop a reputation as a safe haven for blacks during the American War of Independence. Basically, the British offered freedom, land in Canada, and equal rights to any slaves or free blacks who fought on their side during the war. However, Canada was slow to deliver on its promises. And it wasn't until 1803 when a Canadian judge ruled that slavery was incompatible with British law that American blacks began returning to Canada. The reputation of Canada as a refuge for slaves persisted and continued to be passed on using songs, slave hymns, oral stories, and finally, written narratives. One written narrative from 1861, Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl by Harriet Jacobs, originally published under the pseudonym Linda Brant, recounts the life of Brant, a slave in North Carolina. Jacobs later clarifies that Brant's story is based on her own personal life experiences. Brant's tale depicts the horrors she endured while in slavery, including the initial portion of her escape, hiding in an attic for 7 years. While Brant does eventually escape to the northern U.S., she never crosses into Canada. However, throughout the narrative, Brant mentions Canada and, in doing so, is empowered. For example, while she is hiding in the attic, she writes a letter to her former enslaver, Dr. Flint, describing, "One of my letters that fell into his hands was dated from Canada, and he seldom spoke of me now." Having her letter postmarked from Canada is an insinuation that she has fled across the border, and that is what Dr. Flint believes. This subterfuge by Brant is an act of self-reliance and resistance. Brant's resistant acts prove that the quest for freedom is one perpetually in the process, in a state of becoming and possibility. There wasn't a map for runaway slaves to follow in order to gain freedom. They had to be creative and stay determined. Dr. Flint's silence after receiving her letter reaffirms Brant's self-ownership. It also signifies some powerlessness on the part of slaveholders. Dr. Flint knows that it is useless to pursue Brant if she is in Canada. By using the Canadian-U.S. border and its political struggle to her advantage, Brant is attaining self-freedom. This Black self-reliance is empowering because it was taken by Brant. It didn't have to be bought, sold, or given. Self-attained freedom enables Brant to recuperate, and she is then restless and ready to leave the attic, determined to steer for the North Star at all hazards. When Brant arrives in the North in chapter 32, she wishes to visit her daughter, Ellen, whom was given to Mrs. Hobbes by Brant's white lover. She comes up with a plan to enact a falsehood with Mrs. Hobbes so that she can visit her daughter. Brant writes a note to Mrs. Hobbes stating, "I began my note by stating that I had recently arrived from Canada and was very desirous to have my daughter come see me now." According to the article, As If I Had Entered a Paradise, Fugitive Slave Narratives and Cross-Border Literary History by Nancy King, to be American implies that the Black man is still in bondage. To be Canadian means the obverse. This falsehood of having been in Canada is again significant because if Mrs. Hobbes believes that Brant has been in Canada, she is likely to view Brant as a free woman instead of a fugitive slave. This falsehood could be considered what King describes as an act of racial passing or performing freedom. King clarifies that passing demanded the subject's immersion in an environment of self-censorship, continuous surveillance, and highly asymmetrical relations of power. Continually, Brant is forced to self-censor her reactions so that it appears as if she is not challenging the power dynamics in her relationships with people or of other races. Due to Brant performing as a free woman, she is constantly in a state of anxiety that she and her children will be forced back into slavery. She also fears that Mrs. Hobbes will not relinquish her guardianship of Ellen. Mrs. Hobbes even claims that Mr. Sands has given Ellen to her eldest daughter. Although Brant is furious at these comments, she knows that she must remain quiet so that she does not draw unwanted attention. Brant feels as if she is merely performing as a free Black woman. She states, "I called myself free and sometimes felt so, but I knew I was insecure." She worries that she could be exposed at any moment. Brant's passing as a free Black woman to Mrs. Hobbes validates her belief that she can be accepted as free by other people as well. Furthermore, Brant describes the ways in which slaveholders tried to disparage the idealized picture of the North in Canada. In Chapter 8, Brant states, when they visit the North and return home, they tell their slaves of the runaways they have seen and describe them to be in the most deplorable condition. The efforts of the slaveholders to deter their slaves from leaving sometimes backfired. Sharon A. Roger Hepburn's article quotes a fugitive slave as stating that slaves knew Canada was a good country for us because master was so anxious that we should not go there. It seems that the more slaveholders complained about and disparaged the North, the more they enforced the slaves' belief that it is the promised land. Another narrative about slavery that includes images of Canada is Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin, first published in 1851. In her novel, Stowe briefly depicts the way in which Canada is viewed by slaves as an idealized place which they can truly become free in. For example, in Chapter 3, a slave named George tells his wife Eliza that he's going to run away. When Eliza asks him where he is going to go, he states, "To Canada, and when I'm there, I'll buy you. That's all the hope that's left us." This scene echoes the urgency for slaves to escape slavery, claim their freedom, and to reach a safe haven. Canada is where they believed they would be safe and liberated. Chapter 4 depicts a group of enslaved Black parishioners in a prayer meeting, and they sing typical church songs as well as parts of various slave hymns, which include mentions of Jordan's banks, Canaan's fields, and the New Jerusalem. These lyrics are important because they represent a quest to find freedom. Dr. Renford Reese points out that Canada was the biblical canon. Many of the common slave hymns told stories of a heavenly journey to the land of Canaan. Dr. Reese goes on to say that Canada represented a symbolic place that many Black slaves had learned about through biblical teachings. Since slaves could rarely talk freely among themselves, they would spread messages covertly through singing. In chapter 9, as Eliza is on the run with her child, she leaves Kentucky in a dramatic scene by crossing a frozen Ohio River, jumping from ice block to ice block. After crossing the river, she seeks refuge with the Bird family. Mrs. Bird asks where she is going, and Eliza states, "To Canada. If I only knew where that was. Is it very far off, is Canada?" Mrs. Bird replies that it is much farther than you think, poor child. This scene demonstrates that runaway slaves had very little tangible information about Canada. The directions they received were only visual or oral clues passed on through songs and stories. Most of the time, their only sense of direction was to follow the North Star because they could only travel safely during the nighttime. When George and Eliza are finally reunited and are close to reaching Canada, they are confronted by officers. George tells them, "We don't own your laws, we don't own your country, we stand here as free, under God's sky, as you are." This passage is important because it shows George rejecting the United States as his country. What is missing from Stowe's work that is evident in the texts of Harriet Jacobs and Martin Delany is the understanding and acknowledgement that freedom can be self-attained as psychological emancipation. In Stowe's work, although George rejects the U.S. as his country, he is not truly free until he reaches Canada. By studying Delany's Blake or the Huts of America, the awareness that freedom and emancipation are not the same thing becomes clear. In Blake or the Huts of America, the main character, Henry, strives for a freedom that must be taken and not given. Henry decides to escape after his wife is sold by their master, Colonel Franks. He tells the colonel, "I don't want to live with you any longer. I'm not your slave, nor never was, and you know it." In his quest for freedom, Henry becomes a Maroon. Marriage represents a possibility for Black freedom that does not require white intervention. This concept of marriage is greatly lacking in Stowe's text, where the only way for fugitives to gain their freedom is with help from white citizens to cross the border into Canada. At first, Henry tries to persuade other slaves on the Franks plantation to leave with him for Canada, what he describes as free country. After realizing that they will not leave, he decides to travel throughout the Confederacy in order to plan a slave rebellion and overthrow the institution completely. Delany depicts Henry as a revolutionary icon, which is a complete juxtaposition of the image of Stowe's Uncle Tom or George. George is seeking freedom and security for his family, while Henry is seeking a large-scale insurrection and liberation for all that are enslaved. When Henry travels from plantation to plantation, spreading his message, he is psychologically emancipating the slaves he encounters. His mission is his manifesto and becomes the foundation of Black nationalism. The first step in achieving Black nationalism is a psychological one, beginning with the enslaved rejecting their assigned non-subject positions as chattel and recognizing their potential for autonomy and self-determination. Henry is awakening a thirst for freedom in the slaves that has stayed dormant due to enduring years of cruelty, violence, and injustices. This psychological awakening is important to Black nationalism because it bolsters a certain maxim of the theory of marriage. Freedom is not a place, it is a state of being. After this psychological epiphany, it is easy to understand why Delany and his character Henry do not seek freedom in Canada. Immigration and emancipation are not true freedoms because they are granted only through external, white, or state actors. Delaney's view of a Black nationalist freedom must be self-attained because freedom, like people, is not a commodity to be bought or sold. After studying these three narratives, it is obvious that Canada played an important role in the history of slavery within the U.S., as well as in American literature of the 19th century. Although life in Canada may not have been ideal, it did serve as a beacon of hope for those facing the severest conditions and most inhumane treatment known to mankind. It can be argued that Canada's reputation as the Promised Land remains intact to this day. One reason why Canada still appears as a safe haven is because of strict immigration and asylum laws in the U.S. that make it nearly impossible for immigrants and refugees to gain legal entry. A November 2019 news article from the Washington Examiner describes how nearly 50,000 people over the past 3 years have crossed the border into Canada from northern New York State. In 2004, Canada passed an immigration agreement that guarantees immediate admittance to asylum seekers who arrive at Canada's back door. While in the U.S. in 2017 enacted a travel ban which blocked travelers from half a dozen countries. The move was derided by some as a Muslim ban, prompting Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau to welcome refugees into his country. This is only one example of the continued hostile attitude of the U.S. toward marginalized groups of people. It's accurate to claim that Canada has the better reputation when it comes to immigration. The U.S. is a country that was built on racial discrimination, and these problems are still deeply rooted in its society. The reality is that Canada offers hope to desperate people. It is shocking to realize that almost 169 years after Uncle Tom's Cabin, the U.S. is still plagued with racism and discrimination. Maybe the contemporary U.S. needs writers like Jacobs, Delaney, or Stowe to humanize the marginalized, so we can read the words of those that have lived in adversity and come to ask, what would I do in that circumstance? Maybe then our borders, like our hearts, would be a little more open. Thank you.